I want you to start by closing your eyes, just for a second. Unless you're driving, of course, in which case, please keep your eyes on the road.
Yes, definitely.
But if you can, just imagine you are completely weightless. You're wearing a wetsuit, you got that heavy tank strapped to your back, and you were just sort of hovering in the warm turquoise water of the Caribbean.
Sounds pretty good so far. Like the perfect vacation.
It really does, doesn't it? And you hear nothing but the sound of your own breathing. That rhythmic hissing of the regulator, in, out, in, out. You kick your fins just gently and you start to glide down maybe 15, 20 feet.
And the sunlight is dazzling through the water onto the sand below. It's beautiful.
Exactly. You're expecting to see, I don't know, a stingray maybe, or some brain coral. But instead, as the silt you've kicked up begins to settle, you see a wall.
And we're not talking about a natural rock formation, are we?
No, not at all. A brick wall, handmade red clay bricks, covered in barnacles and sea fans, but it is unmistakably architectural.
Somebody built that.
Somebody built that. You swim a little further and you see the clear outline of a paved street. Then you see the archway of a doorframe. Just standing there, alone in the current, you are hovering over a ghost city.
It's such a haunting image. And what's so powerful about it is that you aren't looking at a movie set, and you're certainly not looking at some myth like Atlantis.
Yeah.
You're looking at a real place, a historical site, you could almost say.
Yeah.
You're looking at a crime scene.
That is exactly what it is. It's a crime scene preserved in salt water for over 300 years. This is Port Royal, Jamaica. And today, yeah, it's silent. You might see a barracuda swim through what used to be a window.
Right.
But if we could rewind the tape, go back to the morning of June 7th, 1692, this exact spot would be, well, probably the loudest, most chaotic place on the entire planet.
Oh, the sensory overload would have been just intense. I mean, think about it. The smell of roasting meat and unwashed bodies and open sewage all mixed with gunpowder and salt air.
The sound of merchants shouting in, 4 or 5 different languages? The clinking of Spanish silver being counted in a back room?
And then in literally the blink of an eye.
Silence.
The ocean just swallowed it whole.
It's a story of catastrophic hubris, really.
And that is exactly why we are here. Welcome back to another deep dive on the ABENG Signal.
Today, we are doing a deep dive into a story that I think a lot of people think they know, probably from the movies. We are talking about Port Royal.
The Pirate City.
The Pirate City, exactly. But the version we are covering today, it's not the Disney ride. It's not the sanitized yo-ho-ho and a bottle of rum version of events.
Not even close. The mission for this deep dive is to really strip away that mythology and look at the forensics of a catastrophe. We're looking specifically at the era between 1660 and 1692.
A very tight window.
It's a 32-year bubble. That's it.
A bubble. I like that.
Because that's what it was. A 30-year bubble where geology, hypercapitalism, empire, and just immense human misery all collided in one very small, very unstable place.
We want to understand how a city rises from nothing to become the storehouse of the West Indies, the city of gold, and then how it literally disappears in the span of a few minutes.
And when we say disappears, we don't mean abandoned or it fell into ruin over centuries.
No, we mean swallowed.
We mean the earth opened up and took it back.
Okay, so let's start where any good investigation should start.
We are not just going to be reciting dates and names from a textbook. We are going to unearth the rise and the absolutely biblical fall of Port Royal.
And to be really clear for you listening, this isn't just a fun pirate story. I mean, yes, there are pirates. We will definitely get to the pirates. But this is, at its core, a story about civilization. It's about a city that was built on 3 very specific things.
Okay.
Gold, sin, and sand.
Gold, sin, and sand. I like that.
And we're going to look at what happens when the ground itself, the very earth, literally refuses to hold up a system that's built on those foundations.
Yeah.
It's a story about the wickedest city on earth, sure. But it's also about colonial extraction and stolen bodies and the inevitable collision between human arrogance and geological reality.
So buckle up, or I guess strap on your diving gear. We are going to take you from the height of pirate swagger right down to the moment of judgment. Let's dive in.
Let's do it.
So to really understand this disaster, we have to start with the geography because, usually when you build a major city, a capital even, you pick a spot with some solid bedrock, right? Access to fresh water, maybe some nice rolling hills.
Right, exactly. You look for stability. You look for resources that will sustain a population for centuries.
But the English didn't do that at all. So the big question is, why on earth did they decide to build their Caribbean stronghold on, of all things, a sand spit?
Well, the short answer is necessity. Pure, unadulterated military necessity. You have to put yourself back in their shoes. When the English seized Jamaica from the Spanish in 1655, it wasn't a peaceful handover of power.
Not at all.
It was an invasion.
Yeah.
Part of Oliver Cromwell's grand Western design. And to be honest, it wasn't even their first choice. The main target had been the island of Hispaniola, and that attack failed miserably. So they ended up taking Jamaica almost as a consolation prize.
So they're already on the back foot. They're occupying hostile territory. They've got the Spanish who are furious and want it back. They've got the French lurking nearby, the Dutch. They need a fortress and they need it fast.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And if you look at a map of Kingston Harbour, you'll see it's one of the largest and safest natural harbors in the entire world. It's this massive protected basin. But to get into that harbor, ships have to pass through a relatively narrow channel.
And guarding that channel
is this strange geological feature.
Mm-hmm.
It's a long, thin arm of sand curving out into the sea called the palisados.
It's like a natural breakwater.
It is. It creates this calm anchorage. And at the very, very tip of that sandy arm, you have a perfect strategic choke point. If you can put cannons there, you control the front door to the entire island. You control everything that enters or leaves Jamaica's economy.
And that's where they built the first fort.
That's it. They built Fort Cromwell, which was, later renamed Fort Charles after the monarchy was restored in England in 1660.
So it starts as just a military garrison, a bunch of soldiers sweating in heavy wool coats in the tropical heat, scanning the horizon for Spanish sails.
Exactly. But here is where the unique geography changes everything. This wasn't just a good spot for a fort. It turned out to be a phenomenal spot for a port.
Why is that?
Because the water right next to that sand spit on the protected harbor side was incredibly deep. It just dropped off like a cliff. This meant that massive ocean-going vessel ships, heavy with cannons, packed with tons of cargo, could sail right up to the shoreline.
They didn't need smaller boats, tenders, to ferry goods back and forth from an anchorage.
No, they could literally tie up their ships directly to the land. They could practically lay a plank from the deck of a galleon to the street.
Wow. In the 17th century, that's a game changer for trade. That's like having a deep water port right next to an international airport runway.
It is. It's a logistical dream. So naturally, the merchants looked at the fort and said, this is where we need to be. This is the best place to do business. Warehouses sprang up almost overnight to store sugar and indigo.
And where you have warehouses and sailors, you need taverns.
And brothels. And blacksmiths to repair the ships, and coopers to make the barrels, and bakers to provision the voyages. It spiraled.
And this transition, it happened really fast, right? This wasn't a slow, organic growth over 100 years.
It was explosive. It was what some historians call a mutate. It mutated from a simple military outpost to a dense, chaotic, thriving urban center in less than 30 years. By the 1680s, you had 2,000 buildings crammed into about 50 acres of land.
50 acres. That's tiny. I mean, for perspective, that's smaller than a lot of university campuses. That's an incredible population density.
It was denser than London at the time. And here's the crucial part. Because they wanted to feel like London, to feel permanent and important, they didn't build lightweight wooden huts that might bend and sway.
No, they built with brick.
They built multi-story brick mansions. They built tall, heavy structures with tiled roofs and ornate iron balconies. Real status symbols.
Okay, I just want to pause on that image for a second. They are building 4-story, very heavy, very rigid brick houses on a sand spit.
Yes, on a foundation of loose sediment, coral rubble, and waterlogged sand.
It just screams boomtown mentality. It's like the gold rush in California or an oil boom in Texas. It's all about get the money now, get rich quick, and worry about the foundations later.
That is exactly the mindset. This was a place constructed for speed, for profit, and for defense. Things like urban planning, long-term geological surveys.
Yeah.
Nobody had time for that. They were far too busy getting rich.
And speaking of getting rich, let's talk about how they were doing it. Because Port Royal wasn't exporting corn or manufacturing textiles. This was an economy built on predation.
It was, for a time, the official headquarters of the Brethren of the Coast,
The pirates.
the pirates. But, we need to add some nuance here. Because pirate is a loaded word. And back then, in the mid-17th century, the line between a pirate and a patriot was, well, it was very blurry. We should probably be talking about privateers.
This is the idea of the letter of marque. Explain that for us.
Okay, so put yourself in the English governor's chair. You have this huge, valuable island to defend. You're surrounded by Spanish enemies who want to take it back. And you have almost no Royal Navy ships at your disposal.
It's expensive and slow to send the Navy all the way from England.
Exactly. So what do? You don't have a police force, you don't have a navy.
You essentially deputize the criminals. You outsource the violence.
You hire the wolves to guard the henhouse. The governor issues a letter of marque, which is a legal document, a government contract. It says, you, Captain so-and-so, are hereby authorized by the King of England to attack, seize, and plunder Spanish ships and Spanish cities.
So it's basically a license to steal. Go rob our enemies, bring all the gold back here, spend it in our taverns, and we won't hang you. In fact, we'll call you a hero.
And, crucially, give the crown a 10% cut of everything you steal. It was, for all intents and purposes, state-sponsored organized crime. And for the economy of Port Royal, it worked beautifully. There was a constant injection of hard currency into the system.
I was reading about the sheer volume of wealth. It's hard to even wrap your head around it. We aren't talking about a couple of treasure chests here and there.
Oh, no, we are talking about tons of silver bullion, stacks of pieces of 8, gold crucifixes and chalices melted down from Spanish cathedrals. When a privateer fleet returned from sacking a major city like Portobello or Maracaibo or Panama, the amount of wealth that flooded into Port Royal was just astronomical.
And it filtered down, right? It wasn't just the captains getting rich.
That was the key. An ordinary sailor, a deckhand, could make in one successful weekend what a farm laborer back in England would earn in his entire lifetime.
And I'm guessing they didn't invest it in low-risk mutual funds for their retirement.
Definitely not. It was easy come, easy go. They spent it with a kind of ferocious intensity. There are contemporary accounts of pirates buying entire barrels of wine, dragging them into the middle of the street, smashing the top open with an axe, and then forcing passers-by to drink with them at gunpoint.
Wow.
It was this performative, almost aggressive consumption. They'd swagger down the street wearing silks, velvets, enormous periwigs, trying to mimic the aristocracy, but with this raw, violent, chaotic energy underneath it all.
And you can't talk about this era, this very specific blend of violence and wealth, without talking about the man who embodies it perfectly, Henry Morgan.
Ah, yes, Sir Henry Morgan.
Tax is doing a lot of heavy lifting in his name, isn't it?
It really is. Morgan is the archetype for this entire system. He starts out as a buccaneer, a ruthless, brilliant, tactical genius who leads these massive amphibious raids. His raid on Panama is the stuff of legend for its sheer audacity and its brutality.
He burned the city to the ground.
He did. He marched his men across the isthmus. A terrible journey. And there are these horrifying accounts of him using captured nuns and priests as human shields to get his men close to the fortress walls.
That's not the lovable rogue Jack Sparrow image we get from the movies. That's a war crime.
It absolutely is. He was a warlord, but he was an effective warlord. He completely broke Spanish power in the region. So instead of being arrested and hanged for piracy, what happens?
He gets a promotion.
He gets summoned to London, he's knighted by King Charles II, and he's sent back to Jamaica as the lieutenant governor.
So the poacher becomes the gamekeeper. He literally becomes the law.
He becomes the establishment. He buys up massive sugar plantations, worked by hundreds of enslaved people. He sits as a judge in the very courts that used to sentence men like him. And ironically, he starts hanging pirates who didn't get the memo that the wild days were officially ending.
That whole transition from pirate to politician, from raider to plantation owner, it just shows how incredibly flexible the morality of the time was.
Oh, completely.
It's like, if you steal a little bit, you're a common thief and we hang you. If you steal an entire city's worth of gold, you're a statesman and we give you a title.
Precisely. Morgan's life proves that the wickedness of Port Royal wasn't happening in opposition to the colonial government. For a very long time, it was the colonial government's primary policy. He used piracy to accumulate the capital he needed to become a legitimate member of the plantocracy. He retires to his estates, drinks himself to death, and dies in his bed, a wealthy, respected man.
But while Morgan is up in his great house, drinking his expensive French brandy and counting his Spanish gold, there is a whole other world operating right beneath his feet. We've talked about the gold and we've talked about the sand. Now we have to talk about the sin. And I don't just mean the drinking and the gambling.
No, we have to talk about the foundational sin of the whole enterprise, the exploitation.
Yes. This is the part of the story that often gets drowned out, literally and figuratively, by all the swashbuckling myths. Port Royal was, first and foremost, a slave society.
That's the engine that made it all run. We have to center this.
Right.
Because that gold and silver was heavy, the barrels of sugar were heavy. Who was carrying it all?
Enslaved Africans. The entire glittering facade of Port Royal was polished by forced labor. While the pirates were off having their legendary parties, enslaved men were on the docks in the blistering heat, unloading the plundered cargo from the ships.
And enslaved women were working in the kitchens of the taverns, in the laundry yards of the mansions, and of course serving in the very beds of the men who claimed to own them. The sexual exploitation was endemic.
And the conditions. We already said Port Royal was crowded and dense. For the enslaved population, it must have been a living hell.
It was a pressure cooker. Most enslaved people lived in what were called yards. These were cramped, unsanitary spaces behind the main houses. They had no privacy, no autonomy, nothing. And they were surrounded by a culture of the most extreme violence.
I mean, that's a really important point. If a privateer is willing to torture a Spanish priest for information on where gold is hidden,
Imagine how he treats the human being he legally owns who just spilled his drink. The casual brutality would have been unimaginable.
and it wasn't just enslaved Africans, was it? There was a kind of hierarchy of misery there.
That's right. You also had a large population of poor whites. Many were indentured servants from Ireland, Scotland, or England. These were people who had essentially sold years of their lives for passage to Jamaica, or they were political prisoners, vagrants, people shipped out from the streets of London.
And how were their lives different?
In some ways, their masters treated them with even more brutality. An enslaved person was an investment for life, and an indentured servant was only yours for, say, 7 years. So there was zero incentive to keep them healthy or even alive for the long term. You just worked them as hard as you possibly could before their contract expired.
So what you have is this extreme social stratification. You have the ultra-rich buccaneers and merchants at the very top, living in those fancy brick mansions with their silverware and their silk tapestries.
Right.
And then supporting all of that is this massive base of humanity-enslaved dock workers, indentured domestic laborers, sex workers whose lives are just fuel for the party.
That is the structural violence that's hidden behind the romantic myth of the pirate city. The city was wicked, not just because people were drunk all the time. It was wicked because it was a machine designed to extract value from human beings, whether through the transatlantic slave trade or the exploitation of the poor. It was built on human suffering.
And yet, at the time, the preachers and ministers, they weren't railing against the institution of slavery, were they? Their moral panic was focused elsewhere.
Oh, completely. The moral panic was very, very specific. They weren't concerned with the great moral sin of slavery. They were concerned with the booze and the sex. Ministers called Port Royal the Sodom of the New World.
And to be fair, statistically, they kind of had a point about the vice, didn't they?
They absolutely did. The density of taverns and alehouses was, well, insane.
What was the ratio?
By some estimates, there was one tavern for every 10 residents in the city, men, women, and children included.
1 for every 10. Can you even imagine that? In a modern city, that would be a bar on every single floor of every apartment building.
It's unbelievable, and the volume of alcohol being consumed was staggering. Rum, which they appropriately called Kill Devil brandy, Madeira wine from Portugal. It was a society that was perpetually, fundamentally intoxicated.
And because the population was so transient and so overwhelmingly male sailors, soldiers, pirates, prostitution was just everywhere.
It was an open and accepted part of the city's economy.
But here's the paradox that I find so fascinating. It wasn't just a den of iniquity. It wasn't just lawless chaos. There were respectable people there too. There were churches.
That's the central tension of the place. You had St. Paul's Church right in the center of town, a big, solid brick structure. You had merchants and their families going to a proper Anglican service on Sunday morning, praying for their salvation.
While the tavern next door was probably still roaring from Saturday night's debauchery.
Exactly. The preacher takes the donation into the collection plate, even if the money smells like rum and gunpowder. It was a place where this very loud religious condemnation existed side by side with the immense wealth being generated by all the so-called sinful activities.
Everyone knew where the money came from.
Everyone knew. But as long as the gold kept flowing, the city kept dancing on the sand.
But while they were dancing, that clock was ticking. We've set the scene. The heavy brick buildings, the massive wealth, the exploited underclass. Now, let's go back to the ground itself, the sand.
This is where we have to move from history into hard science, into geology.
So why was this specific spot so uniquely dangerous? We've said it was a sand spit, but break that down for us in geological terms. What was actually under their feet?
Okay, so imagine you have a big glass jar and you fill it with loose marbles. If you pour water into that jar, the water fills all the empty spaces between the marbles.
Okay.
The ground under Port Royal was exactly like that. It was layers of loose sand, gravel, and coral rubble. And it was completely saturated with seawater because the water table was only a foot or two below the surface.
So it's basically a giant waterlogged sponge.
Completely. Now, under normal, everyday conditions, the friction between all those individual grains of sand holds them together. Feels solid, you can walk on it, you can, build a heavy house on it. But if you take that jar of wet marbles and you shake it violently, what happens? The water pressure between the marbles increases dramatically. It pushes the grains apart. They lose contact with each other. The friction drops to zero.
And the solid becomes a liquid.
That is liquefaction. The ground literally, physically, turns into a heavy fluid. It behaves like quicksand, but it happens almost instantly across the entire city.
And they had built these incredibly heavy, very rigid brick houses right on top of this unstable foundation.
It was the worst possible combination you can imagine. Heavy, brittle structures on a foundation that was just waiting for the right trigger to turn into soup. A lightweight wooden shack might have floated or warped. A brick mansion just cracks and sinks straight down.
And did anyone warn them? Surely some engineers or builders at the time must have said, hey, this is probably a bad idea.
There were warnings, yes.
Yeah.
Not in the modern geological sense, but builders certainly knew the ground was soft. They had to drive these huge wooden piles deep down into the sand just to get any kind of stability for their foundations. But again, you have the arrogance of the time and the desperate need for that strategic location. And it just meant they ignored the environmental reality.
It's that colonial mindset. We conquered the Spanish, we tamed the ocean, surely we can conquer this little patch of sand.
It's classic hubris. They didn't understand plate tectonics, of course, but they knew the ground wasn't solid rock. They knew. They just didn't care. The profit was too good, the parties were too loud.
And then came June 7th, 1692.
A Tuesday.
Let's try and reconstruct that morning, because by all contemporary accounts, it was a completely normal, beautiful day.
It was. The sky was clear. The trade winds were blowing gently. The heat was starting to build up, as it always does in Jamaica just before noon. Business as usual.
We have this really detailed account from a man named Dr. Heath, who was the rector of the church.
Yes. His letter is one of our most valuable sources. He had just finished the morning prayer service at St. Paul's. Afterwards, he went to a merchant's house nearby to have a glass of wormwood wine.
Which was, what, a morning digestive?
Apparently. So you have to picture him. He's sitting there, maybe smoking a clay pipe, chatting with his friend, the president of the council, but at the price of sugar, or the latest news from London.
And at the same time, down at the wharves, the ships are being unloaded, the markets are bustling, people are haggling. It's 11:40 a.m. Life is proceeding with this absolute mundane banality.
And that's the terror of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
There was no warning, no storm on the horizon, no ominous clouds, just a lovely Tuesday morning. And then at 11:43 a.m., the floor started to roll.
Heath writes that he felt a gentle rolling at first. He probably thought it was just another small tremor.
Right. Jamaica is a seismically active region. They were used to the ground shaking a little bit from time to time. He actually told his companion, "Never fear, it will soon be over."
Famous last words.
Truly, because just seconds later, the second shock hit. And this wasn't a gentle roll. This was a violent vertical jolt, a massive, catastrophic release of energy from the fault line that runs right into the harbor.
And this is the moment the physics kicks in. The shaking triggers the liquefaction.
Instantly, the solid earth dissolved beneath them. Eyewitness accounts all describe the same unbelievable thing. The street rising up in waves like the ocean, and then huge cracks, fissures opened up in the ground.
And people just fell in.
People fell in. But because the ground was acting like a thick liquid, the fissures didn't just stay open. As the shockwave passed, the sand would settle back down. The earth closed around them.
Oh my God,
There are these absolutely nightmarish accounts of people being buried alive up to their necks, trapped in the middle of the street, unable to move, with stray dogs coming and eating their heads while they were still alive and screaming.
That is the stuff of nightmares.
It is absolute, unmitigated horror.
Yeah.
And the buildings, those heavy brick mansions we talked about, they didn't crumble and fall over like they would on solid rock. They sank. They just slid vertically down into the slush.
So 1 minute, you're in your second story bedroom.
The next minute, that same room is at street level, and the ground floor has completely disappeared beneath you.
And on the waterfront, where the biggest warehouses and the main forts were, it was even worse.
The entire waterfront suffered what's called a slope failure. The wharves, the warehouses, the fortifications at Fort Charles, about 33 acres of the most valuable land in the city, just slid off the underwater shelf and plunged into the deep water of the harbor. In an instant. Gone.
And if the ground turning into liquid wasn't enough, then came the water from above.
The tsunami. The massive displacement of all that land under the harbor caused a huge wave to recoil and then sweep back over what was left of the sand spit.
I read about this ship, the HMS Swan. This story just blows my mind.
The Swan was a Royal Navy frigate that was docked for repairs, its hull being cleaned. The tsunami wave picked it up, a massive wooden warship, and carried it over the tops of the houses that were already sinking into the sea.
It literally sailed over the city.
It sailed over the rooftops. It actually crushed a few buildings as it passed, but miraculously, it ended up acting as a lifeboat. People who were being washed away, drowning in the churning water, managed to grab onto its rigging and its ropes as it floated by. That one ship is credited with saving hundreds of lives.
But for most people, there's just no escape.
No. In a matter of minutes, less time than we've been talking about this, Port Royal was completely decimated. 2/3 of the city was underwater. An estimated 2,000 people died instantly.
It's just so hard to process the speed of it. You're counting your gold 1 minute, and the next, you are underwater, trapped inside a room that is sinking to the bottom of the harbor floor.
And for the survivors, standing there in the mud and the ruins, surrounded by the screams of the dying, the interpretation of what had just happened began immediately.
They didn't have seismographs, they didn't know about tectonic plates or liquefaction.
No. They looked at the utter destruction, the scale of the cataclysm, and they saw only one possible explanation.
God's judgment.
It was the only framework that made any sense to them. The wickedest city on earth had been struck down by an angry God. It was Sodom and Gomorrah, made real in the Caribbean.
The preachers who had been railing against the city's sins for years must have had an absolute field day. I told you so.
It was a powerful, terrifying confirmation of their entire worldview. Dr. Heath himself wrote that he hoped this terrible judgment would lead to the reformation of the sinful survivors. To them, the earthquake wasn't a random geological event. It was a targeted, righteous strike. The center of sin had been pinpointed and erased by the Almighty.
But you have a really interesting take on this. You've written about this as the theology of colonial guilt.
I do. I think there's something deeper going on there. Think about it. You are living in a colony that was built on stolen land. You are generating your immense wealth from the forced labor of stolen people. You are using constant violence to maintain your power. Deep down, even if you justify it all legally and economically, there has to be a subconscious fear.
A fear that what you're doing is fundamentally wrong.
A fear that the bill is eventually going to come due, that the natural order, or God's order, is going to reject you and your entire system. When the earthquake hit, I think it tapped into that deep-seated anxiety. It confirmed their worst unspoken fear that their prosperity was illegitimate and that they were being punished for their blood crimes.
So the earthquake was then used as a tool to discipline the survivors. Repent your sins, or the rest of the island will sink into the sea too.
Exactly. It reinforced the existing moral narrative. It became a very useful tool for social control in the chaotic aftermath.
But the suffering, it didn't end when the ground stopped shaking. In some ways, the aftermath sounds even worse than the quake itself.
It was a slow, agonizing death for the city and for many of its survivors. You have to imagine the scene. Thousands of bodies, both human and animal, are now floating in the harbor or trapped under the mud. And the tropical sun is beating down on all of it.
The smell, the disease.
The smell was unbearable. And with the sanitation systems completely gone, this created the perfect breeding ground for disease.
The malignant fever, they called it.
Right. Most likely cholera, typhoid, dysentery. A plague swept through the camps of refugees who were huddled on the remaining patch of dry land. It's estimated that another 3,000 people died from disease in the weeks following the earthquake.
So more people died from the disease in the aftermath than from the quake itself.
Yes. It was a catastrophe compounded by biology, a secondary disaster.
And amidst all of this death and divine judgment, you also mentioned looting. That's just the darkest side of human nature, isn't it?
It is. You would think, in the face of what they saw as God's wrath, people would be on their knees praying. But many were praying. The Wild West nature of the city came roaring back instantly.
What were they doing? Just scavenging?
Scavenging, yes.
Yeah.
People, both some survivors and looters who came over from the mainland, were breaking into the ruined warehouses to steal rum and supplies. Worse, they were stripping jewelry off the dead bodies floating in the water. There were reports of looters cutting off the swollen fingers of corpses just to get their gold rings.
That is just grim. It's like the city's greed had one last desperate gasp for air.
It shows that the wickedness wasn't washed away by the water. It was just laid bare. The thin veneer of civilization had cracked open right along with the earth.
So Port Royal is broken, it's drowning, it's diseased. What happens next? Do they just abandon it?
They try to rebuild. They really do. They patch up the remaining forts. They build some simple wooden houses. But it's like the place is cursed. A few years later, a massive fire sweeps through and destroys much of what they'd rebuilt. Then a powerful hurricane hits. It just seemed like the universe was determined to erase the place for good.
So they finally get the message and look across the harbor.
They look to the mainland. to the wide, flat Liguania Plain. And the survivors, the merchants, the government, they decide to start fresh. They decide to move. They found a new city on solid ground with a planned, grid-like street pattern. And they saw the future. They saw Kingston.
Well, they saw the place that would become Kingston. The disaster forced a shift in power. They realized finally that they couldn't build their future on a shifting sand spit. So the center of trade, the center of government, all of it moved across the water to Kingston. Kingston was essentially born as a refugee camp for the survivors of Port Royal.
So in a very real way, the earthquake that destroyed Port Royal gave birth to modern Jamaica's capital city.
It completely reshaped the island's future. Port Royal limped on for centuries as a naval station. Lord Nelson was famously stationed there later. But its glory days, its days as the city of gold and sin, were over forever. It became a sleepy fishing village, holding its secrets under the wave. And that is the birth of modern Kingston.
Yes, Kingston is the child of the Port Royal disaster. The center of gravity for the entire island shifted permanently from that precarious sand spit to the mainland. Port Royal would linger on as a small naval base piece. Horatio Nelson was famously stationed there later in his career, but the great city of gold and sin was gone forever.
It really is a story of displacement. The ocean reclaimed the land, and the people were forced to move on and start again.
And in a strange way, by doing so, the ocean preserved the city for us. Because all those buildings that sank into the harbor, they were sealed in the oxygen-free silt at the bottom.
Which brings us right back to where we started this conversation, the diver in the water.
Exactly. When archaeologists dive on Port Royal today, they find this incredible, perfectly preserved time capsule from 1692. They find pewter plates with the remains of a meal still on them. They find bottles of wine with the corks still in. They find the brass pocket watches of the victims, their hands frozen at exactly 11.43.
That's so intimate. It's not just history when you see a pocket watch. That's a person's life, interrupted in a single terrifying moment.
It truly is the Pompeii of the New World. But instead of volcanic ash, it was sealed by water. And instead of ancient Romans, it's the ancestors of modern Jamaica.
As we wrap this up, I'm thinking about the ghosts that you mentioned at the very beginning. When we look at those underwater ruins today, what should we be seeing? What should we be remembering?
We shouldn't just see the swaggering pirates. We shouldn't just see the romance of the high seas that Hollywood loves so much. We should force ourselves to see the complexity.
We should see the cost of all that gold.
Yes. The ghosts of the enslaved workers who were trapped in the cellars when the water rushed in. The ghosts of the poor indentured women who had no way to escape. Their stories are literally submerged, and we have to work to bring them to the surface.
It's such a powerful reminder. We build our great civilizations, we pile up our wealth, we think we are the masters of the world. But if we choose to build on foundations of stolen bodies and stolen land,
and if we willfully ignore the reality of the ground beneath our own feet,
it can all disappear in an instant.
That, I think, is the enduring lesson of Port Royal. It's a profound lesson in both environmental and moral humility.
What a journey. From the noisy, chaotic taverns to the silent seafloor, it really makes you look at history in a different light. It's not just words in a book, it's real people, real mistakes, and very, very real consequences.
Absolutely. And it's a signal, an ABENG signal, if you will, warning us to pay close attention to the foundations we're building on today, whether those are physical foundations in coastal flood zones or the moral foundations of our global economy.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for breaking this all down with us. It's been a truly fascinating deep dive.
My pleasure. It's a story that absolutely needs to be remembered.
And thank you to you, our listener, for diving in with us. We hope this story stays with you the next time you look out at the ocean.
Indeed.
See you on the next episode.
Port Royal's ghosts have a lot to teach us about what it means to build on stolen bodies and stolen land. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more uploads. We have some really incredible stories coming up that you won't want to miss.
Until then,
let's keep the signal strong.
Bye.
Bye. See you on the next episode.
See you in the next chapter.